Okay, well, it is 11 o'clock, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to the Not All Flame is the Same webinar. We had over 400 people register and are excited for your enthusiasm around this topic. My name is Carrie Berger, and I'm the Oregon State University Extension's Fire Program Manager. I'm here with most of the fire team today, and before we dive in, I'd like to briefly explain what it is Extension does. So whether it's forestry, natural resource extension, or 4-H extension, all of us in extension work to bring the latest science, knowledge, and tools to local communities to inspire learning, engagement, and action. So I'm sure at this point, most of you have attended many Zoom webinars and are familiar with the buttons, but in case not, at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A icon. So if you have questions related to the content of the webinar, please put that in the Q&A. You can turn off closed captioning by clicking on the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen and select captions. This webinar, for your information, is being recorded and will be shared on the Forestry and Natural Resource Extension YouTube page, and I'll be sure to send that in a follow-up email to you. And then finally, as we discussed today, fire throughout Oregon, we recognize that for many of you who have experienced fire or know someone who has experienced fire, that the content may be triggering for you. The team has taken great care to be mindful of that, and we ask that if you do feel triggered, that you please take care of yourself in whatever way you need. So now I'd like to hand it over to the director of the fire program, Emily Jane Davis.
Good morning, everyone. We're really glad to have you here and to see people from all around the state, and I think outside of the state too. Carrie, next slide, please. So I know a lot of you are here because you're concerned about wildfire, and you know that we've been experiencing increasingly large wildfires. Here's a map of the large wildfires we've had in Oregon from 2012 to 2021. Next slide, please, Carrie. Today, we're going to be talking about Oregon's ecological and cultural history of fire and how our relationship as people with fire has changed over time, as well as why we have challenges with fire today. So we'll be providing context about ecology, historic patterns, and trends in wildfire in all these different places around Oregon. And so why does this understanding matter? Why are we offering a webinar about Not All Flames the Same? In short, what we want to convey is that fires had this big influence on the trees, the plants, the animals, the soils, and more, but its role is different around the state. Looking at all these pictures of our beautiful, diverse state, we're half covered in forest, but that includes everything from coastal fog belt forests to oak woodlands to ponderosa pines, redwoods, and subalpine vegetation. And nearly a third of the state is rangeland and has a huge diversity of grasses, forbs, and shrubs. While some of these ecosystems can burn as often as every year, some of them only burn every few hundred years. And so what we want to get across is how we experience and live with fire, therefore necessarily is just going to need to look really different from the coast to the gorge to the sage steppe and everywhere in between. Next slide, please. I want to start with a quick concept around fire regimes. Again, because we have such a diverse state, it makes sense that we would also have what we call really diverse fire regimes. This is a core concept in fire ecology, and it's a way of characterizing fire at the ecosystem or landscape level, and essentially describing its spatial and temporal aspects and its ecological impacts, and what we know about those over long time frames and through multiple cycles of fire. So this includes things like how frequently fires occur, how much vegetation they kill, the type of fire that tends to happen, for example, if it's a surface or ground fire versus a crown fire that's up in the canopies of trees, and how many acres are affected and patch sizes. Fires are also shaped by, or fire regimes are also shaped by topography. So how steep are slopes, which way are they facing or their aspect, and what are other terrain features that can influence how fire moves through an area. They are also affected by how much ignition occurs and patterns of where those ignitions tend to take place. For example, we all know that when storms move through, there tend to be certain areas that get a lot of lightning strikes or lightning belts. And there's also been places where indigenous people have routinely burned areas over the year. And then finally, land use and fire and forest and rangeland management also affect a fire regime because they play a role in selecting the species, age, structure, and types of vegetation that are present. Next slide, please, Karen. So this is a map of the fire regimes in Oregon. Now that we know what fire regimes are, each of the colors across the state indicates a different fire regime. So for example, fire regime 1 is all the light green that you see stretching through the Willamette Valley, Southern Oregon, parts of Eastern Oregon. These are areas where, given the elevation and the types of vegetation present, we know that fire has historically occurred fairly frequently, happening between every year and every 35 years. And because it was a regular part of those ecosystems, it's typically not been as severe. Usually we would say that it's lower mixed severity. And then we can contrast that with fire regime condition 5, which is the darkest green that you see on the map along the Coast Range and the Cascades. Here, historically, we've thought that fires occur far less frequently. So on average, every 200 years or further apart, but that when they happen, they're very severe and they're stand replacing. There's no limitation because there's so much fuel, and that can result in near total mortality of trees. However, there's also really new emerging fire history research for those areas that's also suggesting that fire might have occurred more frequently than we thought, and it was not always stand replacing, and that was likely due to indigenous fire stewardship. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, I also want to emphasize that people are intrinsically interwoven with fire. When we present fire regimes, it's not something that's apart from us. Culture and fire are not separate. So a huge part of these historic fire regimes is how often and where indigenous people used fire. It's important to know that these largely depended on the cultural context and why or for what purpose they were doing this. This map is just showing the tribes of the coast, Willamette Valley, and West Cascades, just to give that point that this was a very diverse and socially complex set of groups who have used fire in many specific different ways over time. But generally speaking, the cultural use of fire has allowed people to interact with and essentially adjust their local ecosystems so that they can produce food and tools and materials, medicines, do things like maintain clearings and travel routes, and also reduce the risk of larger and more severe fires from fuel building up. And importantly, historic and current indigenous relationships with fire aren't just about those products or services that result as well. As cultural practitioners and researchers have noted, fire is often seen with respect rather than fear, and as a being to be in relationship with, along with other specific plants and places. Next slide, please. So our goals for today are that we hope you'll leave with the following outcomes. We hope to spur your curiosity about how fires have this ecological role in shaping our diverse forests and rangelands, and how different parts of our state have those different fire histories and different fire stories today. And we also want to spark for you an understanding of why wildfires are becoming bigger and more severe and what's driving those changes. Next slide. So the we that I've been referring to here is our team of regional fire specialists who have all joined us today. Carrie as the program manager and myself. And our program was started in 2020, and our goal is to provide wildfire outreach, education, and engagement through a place-based approach that's focused on supporting the adaptation of both communities and landscapes to fire. And we also try to have fun together while doing it. So you're now going to learn a little bit from each of the regional fire specialists about where they work. This is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour around the state, offering snapshots of fire stories in several different regions. And we're going to begin that tour on the coast with our first regional fire specialist, Aaron Groth.
Okay, thank you, EJ. As EJ mentioned, I'm Aaron Groth. I'm the regional fire specialist for the coast. Thanks so much for joining us. Even within the Coast Range, there's a great deal of fire variability across that ecoregion. And so this map is showing the different potential vegetation types, and they include Sitka spruce forest. It's a picture of Oswald West State Park, followed by Douglas fir forest. And then we also have valley margin forest, which is a little bit drier. Only about 2% of the Coast Range is comprised of true fir forest, but there's a picture of Saddle Mountain. And then we also have oak woodlands of the foothills of the eastern slopes of the Coast Range meeting the Willamette Valley. Carrie, next slide, please. So historically, the role of wildfire across the Coast Range is highlighting the variable fire behavior and also the adaptation of different vegetation to fire across these diverse landscapes. Humans account for the vast majority of ignitions, approximately 90%, and lightning counts for about 10% of ignitions. Low intensity, frequent fire played a key role in maintaining grasslands and meadows of the Coast Range and also oak woodlands in the foothills of the eastern slopes of the Coast Range. These fire-dependent ecosystems thrived with indigenous burning prior to 1855, but are now in decline. The Sitka spruce forest in the coastal fog belt and Douglas fir forest of the Coast Range experienced far higher precipitation and less wildfire than oak woodlands and valley margin Douglas fir forests. Sitka spruce forest and Douglas fir forests of the Coast Range are among the world's most dense and productive forest types, producing thick vegetation and accumulating heavy fuel loads. Ignitions during this period, coupled with east wind events, can produce high-intensity fires, killing most trees. Certain trees, such as Sitka spruce, western hemlock, and western red cedar, lack adaptations to fire, and this can lead to tree mortality or damage after wildfire. And so the map is depicting historic fires that have been documented across the Coast Range for 1850, the Yacolt Fire of 1902, also known as the Columbia Burn, and then the 1933 Tillamook Fire. Next slide, please. Okay, currently research indicates that historically the coastal fog belt forests, as well as the Douglas fir forest, burned infrequently and at high intensity. However, this has been said of moist forests before and eventually proven incorrect in other areas. It is well documented, as shown in that map, that large fires occurred in the late 1800s and mid-1900s. While the overall probability of wildfire happening today in the coastal fog belt is still relatively low, extreme conditions such as the preceding drought and east wind events dramatically heighten fire hazard and risk. We know little about indigenous use of fire within the Coast Range and forests prior to Euro-American settlement. So further study of indigenous use of fire and cultural fire is required. So in terms of these historic conditions, yes, there were occasional infrequent stand replacing fires, but there were also potentially low and medium intensity fires that were occurring across this landscape, and that requires greater research. Next slide, please. Okay, so current conditions, we've got a lot more compared to the Tillamook burn of 1933. Across the Coast Range, there is a far greater amount of infrastructure, including roads, including recreation sites, and also homes of people, as well as other infrastructure. So under the Oregon Department of Forestry and rapid attack and suppression against fire, most fires are kept small, under 1 acre across this ecoregion. But if there are drought conditions, an east wind event, fires can grow very rapidly and kill many trees. So in the past 150 years, fire patterns across Oregon's Coast Range have dramatically shifted, and this is due to multiple drivers. We have a larger coastal population, changes in land use, and also the introduction of invasive species. So some forest types, including oak woodlands, may have seen increases in vegetation and fuel loading due to that fire suppression and elimination of indigenous or cultural use of fire. Climate change has increased temperatures, decreased summer precipitation, and extended droughts. These climatic factors can increase the risk and potential intensity of wildfires. And collectively, these drivers have impacted ecological processes. Next slide, please. As highlighted by the photo to the left, as well as the map that's under it, that is the Echo Mountain 2020 fire. And although it was only about 2,500 acres in extent, it had a great impact. It impacted over 300 structures and impacted people's septic and water systems as well. There is also work being done by federal agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Nature Conservancy. At Cascade Head, there is burning in coastal grasslands, and then there is also burning that is occurring in those oak woodlands of the eastern slopes of the Coast Range. And then the final photo shows the Scoggins Creek fire, a 2014 fire just to the immediate west of Hag Lake. And so this was a fire of 214 acres that impacted Stimson lumberlands, but it required a conflagration order from the governor. So you had incident management teams from Oregon Department of Forestry, as well as the Oregon State Fire Marshal. And it impacted Forest Grove's water supply. So as I said, there's a great deal of variability across this ecoregion, and I'll pass it off to my next colleague. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Adlam, and I'm coming to you from the Rogue Valley in Southwest Oregon. And our region is very different from the Northwest coast. We are in a much drier area here, cut from the same cloth as Northern California, a Mediterranean climate, extremely diverse in plant species, some of which occur nowhere else. That's one of the things I love about this region. So next slide, please, Carrie. We know that this area historically saw a lot of fire, and that's part of the reason why we have so much diversity here. How do we know that? One of the things we can do is look at scars on trees like this. You will see these if you're hiking in Southwest Oregon. I guarantee you, we call them cat face scars. And if you look carefully, you will see these layers inside of those scars. And each layer is from a different fire that left its mark when it passed through and tickled the base of that tree trunk. And you can see so many layers on this particular one. It shows that this tree lived through many, many, many fires. Scientists can go back and count the rings in between each fire scar to tell us how often fire burned and even date the year those fires occurred. We know in that way that fire occurred in the Rogue Valley about every 8 years in the past. So in my area, that would have been 5 times within my lifetime that you would have expected this area to burn, and it hasn't burned once in over 100 years. This is unprecedented for these ecosystems to have such a lack of fire. Next, please. And the changes that happened once fire started to be removed, that was noted in the 1800s already. The change happened once indigenous people were removed from these areas. And that happened at the conclusion of the Rogue Wars in 1856, when members of this, members of the local tribes were removed to the Siletz and Grand Ronde reservations. And General Joseph Lane, who was an important part of the treaty writing at Table Rocks at that time, came back 30 years later and described the following changes. The hilltops, now covered by dense thickets of manzanita, madrone, or evergreen brush, were then devoid of bushes and trees because of the Indian habit of burning over the surface to remove obstructions to their seed and acorn gathering. Next. We also see that we have quotes from the time from indigenous people who were trying to explain to government officials why burning was important to them. This is a quote from a man we know as Klamath River Jack, who lived just in Northern California, not far from here on the Klamath River. And he explained this, saying, Indian burn every year just same. So keep old ground clean, no bark, no dead leaf, no old wood on ground, no old wood on brush. So no bug can stay to eat leaf, and no worm can stay to eat berry and acorn. Not much on ground to make hot fire, so never hurt big trees where fire burn. Now, white man never burn. He passed law to stop all fire in forest and wild pasture. Next. This policy of putting out all fires that emerged especially after 1910, this was not unanimously popular, by the way, at the time. This is a quote from a local newspaper in 1903, somebody writing in to complain, saying, one of the greatest pieces of folly is preventing fires to be set in the hills and government reservations until the brush and undergrowth become so high and thick that when the inevitable fire comes, the whole forest is destroyed. Old settlers and Indians know that the only safe method is to annually burn off the undergrowth when it is so thin that it would not endanger the big trees. Then the grass can grow and you have a beautiful forest instead of a fire trap. This perspective, for better or worse, did not prevail, and the policy became excluding fire, putting out all fires, making fire the enemy, something to stamp out. And these three pictures on the left, you can see represent the changes that we've seen in our area. On the left, that is a large black oak. That is a Southwest Oregon special tree, and it grew in an open forest with a lot of space. But without fire, lots of seedlings have grown up of Douglas firs and shaded that tree out, and it is now dead. And you can see the pine in that third photo from the left. That pine is a large old growth pine that also was growing in an open forest without competition. And now it's surrounded by smaller trees. These pines can only reproduce if they have open space with bare ground with sunlight. We have species like our iconic sugar pine that are declining across their whole range because of the lack of fire to maintain their habitat. I keep saying the lack of fire, and this might sound surprising because we see a lot of big fires, but overall we have less area burning now, about 1/10 compared to what we had historically. But when the fire inevitably comes, like it says in that quote, you get this on the right, which is a really large area where every single tree was killed. This is the Slater fire. And when you have such a large area of dead trees without any seed trees available to make a new generation of trees, it's difficult to imagine how this area will recover. Next. Now, I don't want to demonize wildfire either, right? We need to also appreciate the fact that fire is essential to our ecosystems. And even though it is really scary in summer, and I know I was in evacuation last year, so I know what that's like, we also need to appreciate that fire does create diverse habitat for a lot of different species, like you can see in this picture, where you have different habitats that will accommodate lots of different species because of the effect of wildfire. Next. And I'll just leave you that was kind of maybe a downer, but I want to leave you with a note that people are working hard to bring back fire as a natural process that provides for the safety of our communities and the thriving of our incredible biodiversity in this area. The two pictures on the left, those are landowners and fire professionals working together through what we call prescribed burn associations to complete private land prescribed burns. That picture in the middle, that is a cultural burn with members of Siletz and Grand Ronde once again burning in their ancestral lands here in Southwest Oregon to take care of the oak trees and meadows. And of course, not to leave out our federal partners in places like the Ashland watershed, who have used fire for many years to maintain the health of that area. So that's a snapshot, and I will pass it on to our next fire specialist. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Whirlwind tour. I hope everyone is hanging on. But that this sets me up really nice to talk about fire in the Willamette Valley and the Western Cascades. I'm Kayla Bordelon. I'm the regional fire specialist for the Willamette Valley and what we call the North Cascades region, which covers the Columbia Gorge as well, based in Lynn County. And it's a real pleasure in my job to get to work with this huge diversity of communities in my region, everything, from the urban core of Oregon. My region is home to half of the population in the state, out to small rural communities in the foothills of the Cascades. And this region has a really wide diversity of fire stories to tell as well. Looking at the two photos here on this slide, on the top you see an example of a restored Willamette Valley upland prairie with its widely spaced white oaks and grassy understory. And in the lower picture, you can get a sense for the Western Cascades as you go up in elevation to the east of the Willamette Valley. The Cascades get a lot more precipitation than the valley and are generally more densely vegetated with evergreens, right? Conifer trees. In particular, we see Douglas fir, western hemlock, grand fir. And as you go up in elevation, more true fir, subalpine species. So with this variety of climate and vegetation across the valley and the Cascades, you can imagine that fire would act really differently across these landscapes too, that the fire regimes that EJ talked about, the patterns of fire, would be really different. So we're going to dig into that in these two ecoregions. Next slide, Carrie. Great. So historically in the Willamette Valley, we saw very frequent fire. So we're talking prior to colonization here. On the valley floor, any given patch of ground was estimated to burn every 2 to 7 years. And there were, somewhat longer return intervals as you moved up in elevation towards the foothills. So that's a lot of fire, right? They were mostly small patchy fires that created a mosaic of different vegetation types like open grasslands, oak groves, and ribbons of riparian vegetation along waterways. And as Chris really did a good job describing for his region, fire here in the Willamette Valley was also, sometimes ignited by lightning, but very often ignited by the indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land with fire over time, such as the Kalapuyan people in the area where I live. And in the valley, similar to what Chris described, you can think of that really frequent fire use as a spring cleaning for the land. Okay, it really helped native plants and first foods thrive, like camas, which is pictured up on the top in the middle, white oak. It minimized the spread of pests and disease and promoted, generally biodiversity across the landscape. Also, with that regular fire, it really kept those fuel amounts minimal. So that fire was fairly low intensity, meaning sort of a mild level of heat. And it was mostly surface fire, burning along the ground, not killing a lot of trees, which is what we call low severity fire. The painting in the background shows what the northern Willamette Valley looked like around 1847. You can see kind of vast expanses of prairie and a lack of dense stands of trees like fir and hemlock that we see today in that area. As those really great quotes that Chris used described, that frequent fire minimized the encroachment of Douglas fir into the valley, which is more common in the foothills of the Willamette Valley where, there's more rain, we saw less fire. Next slide. Okay, so the Western Cascades have a really different story of fire. Historically, with, a lot more precipitation, cooler temperatures, the Western Cascades experienced less fire than the valley. And that combination of, lots of precip, mild climate, less fire generally, allowed for some of the most dense and productive forest types to flourish in this area. And, as EJ mentioned in the intro, we're learning now through kind of newer studies that even though we had this moist, cool climate that really moderated the ability for fire to start and spread in the Western Cascades historically, we are finding that small fires, patchy, small, lower and mid-intensity fires were common in the Western Cascades historically. And then in periods of drought, these forests, given that massive amount of fuel, that thick vegetation, these forests experienced larger and hotter fires than the Willamette Valley. They were just less frequent. As the map indicated, the fire regimes map, the return intervals in the mid elevations of the Cascades were 100 to 300 years, and in some areas at higher elevations, even more. So infrequently, we'd see large, what we call stand replacing fires. Next slide. So how have things changed over the past 200 years? Down in the Willamette Valley, obviously urbanization, right, and agricultural development have fundamentally altered the landscape and the relationship of this place and fire. What you see in this picture is really just the patchiness of the valley with this mix of different vegetation types, frequent roads, lots of human infrastructure, agriculture. And then with so many high value resources like homes, timber, ag, we see a lot more resources dedicated to fire response, to fire suppression, like local fire departments, state agencies, federal agencies. So we actually see a lot less fire now on the landscape in the Willamette Valley than we did historically. And most fires that start are contained to very small areas. One click, Carrie. For example, this is a fire right outside of the area where I live in Corvallis that was accidentally ignited in a natural area right outside of town. That's typical. Over 80% of ignitions in the valley are accidental human ignitions. And this fire burned quickly through the grass here in this natural area, much like it would have historically in this vegetation type. But it was quickly suppressed by fire responders that came from all over the region before it burned any homes. You can see that it burned right to the back steps of this apartment complex in Northwest Corvallis. And it's important to mention before I move on to the Cascades that where we have larger patches of unmanaged vegetation around the Willamette Valley, wildfires may burn hotter and be more severe than they would have been prior to colonization due to those heavier fuel loads that Chris described that have accumulated in the absence of regular indigenous burning. You can kind of think of it as a difference between spring cleaning, say your attic or your garage, like, getting rid of the junk once a year, or the big job it is to clean up after, 50 years, or in this case, 200 years of accumulated clutter on the landscape. Next slide. So things have shifted in the Western Cascades over the last 200 years as well. We now have a really different mix of land ownerships and forest types. We have large blocks of private industrial forests, tend to have younger forests that are more intensively managed, a lot of access roads. And those are often adjacent to or intermixed with or close enough to federal forests that have a pretty diverse range of forest conditions, from young stands to more complex old forests. Fewer roads as you get up into the Cascades. And in the lower and mid elevations of the Western Cascades, we are seeing some large wildfires occur as we've been experiencing this long-term drought. And that's often coupled with extreme fire weather, really low humidity, high winds, sometimes those dry east wind events as well. I'm sure a lot of you will remember the Labor Day fires of 2020, including the Riverside fire in Clackamas County that's pictured on the left here. And in this picture, you're seeing a mix of fire severity, meaning there's patches where the fire burned really hot and killed swaths of trees, and other patches where we saw less tree mortality, which is kind of typical for these types of fires. And with that whirlwind tour of the Willamette Valley and Western Cascades complete, I'm passing the torch on to the next region.
So we're moving to the east now, and we're heading over into the East Cascades ecoregion. This ecoregion is really long, so it extends all the way from northern Washington down, or southern Washington, all the way down to northern California, and takes in the whole length of Oregon along the way. And it essentially starts at the Cascade Crest and is east of there, incorporating all the mountains and foothills. But it stops west of the other ecoregions of the Columbia Plateau, the Blue Mountains, and the Basin and Range. I know some of us live there, a lot of us work and recreate there. So we know that those key characteristics of that ecoregion are that it has more extreme temperatures than the west side. It tends to have less precipitation because of that rain shadow effect of the Cascades, and we have more falling as snow there. And then also that it's shaped by volcanic features, and that a lot of the soil is diverse, but that it's volcanic in origin. So things like ash from Mount Mazama, more localized flows of basalts. Next. I really love the East Cascades because it is such a diverse place, and because it's a place where there are a lot of really interesting questions about land management, and there have been a lot of interesting collaborative efforts to work together. So for example, up in the upper right-hand corner, we have Wasco County, North Central Oregon, as part of this ecoregion. It's home to Oregon white oak and ponderosa pine woodlands, which are filled with a lot of plants, pollinators, and songbirds. And you have groups like the East Cascades Oak Partnership working together to develop strategies to conserve those oak habitats. When you're down in central and south central Oregon, you see a lot of different mixed conifer forests, especially as you're moving up in elevation. You see those large thick barked ponderosa pines down in areas like outside of Sisters when you're driving in there, and lodgepole pine stands like this one on the left as you're moving up in elevation. And also it's common to see juniper and mixed conifer woodlands like the ones on the bottom right here shown outside of Paisley. Next slide. Well, a lot of what my colleagues have shared already about the effects of fire suppression and how forests have changed over time is true in the East Cascades as well. But I will say that it's important to understand that both lightning and indigenous management practices historically played a role in removing a lot of dead vegetation and also in removing weakened and diseased trees. That actually allows more airflow through the stands. And thinking about that quote that Chris shared, there were actually less bugs or things like bark beetles able to have pheromones that could build up in that area. So it also further helped support forest health. And a lot of these trees, under these conditions, they didn't grow a lot of lower limbs. Those lower limbs naturally pruned off, so you didn't have ladder fuel going up the trees. Shrubs stayed pretty small, and so we had a lot more of that surface fire or ground fire. Fire also contributed to that thicker bark growth that you see on ponderosa pines and to the natural cycling of nutrients in the soil. And I'm sharing this elevation gradient because it's a good way to think about all of the diversity of vegetation types in the East Cascades and where you can find them. And fire's history has been a little different across this gradient. So when you're looking at lower elevations, a lower or mixed severity fire was the primary disturbance in those dry mixed conifer and ponderosa pine forests, along with potentially some mixed severity in forest types like moist mixed conifer, moist lodgepole, and juniper. And others have noted that we have some forest types that have that more open spacing. So in Central Oregon, Southern Oregon, this is a lot of ponderosa pine, juniper woodlands that had that open spacing. And that really plays a role because fuel was not spreading between those trees and making them really large. Whereas we know that higher elevation forest types that have species like mountain hemlock or whitebark pine, they had those higher severity fires with stand replacing results, and then a whole cohort of new trees would regrow of the same age. Next. If I could sum up all the changes in time in the East Cascades, it would just be, we have less space between trees. They're denser, they're more prone to fire spread now. And we have younger trees and invasive grasses that create more continuous fuel, and that we have more people living, recreating, and working in these areas. So for example, if you've been driving Highway 242 at higher elevations, both east and west of Mackenzie Pass, you can see some fires that are burning in high elevation more and in some of those subalpine areas like the 2017 Millie Fire or the Separation Fire. Mixed conifer forests are also continuing to be at risk of larger and more severe wildfires. A good example of that is the 2021 Bootleg Fire. It was Oregon's third largest wildfire, and it burned across Klamath and Lake counties. And we know that a big factor in that was both the dryness of the fuels, the area has been in drought for a long time, as well as increased tree density. So studies of changes in tree density over time in some of the areas affected by the Bootleg Fire show that in 1920, there was on average 28 trees per acre. And in 2017, that number was 95 trees per acre. So more fuel and more dry fuel. And then for the ponderosa pine and juniper woodlands, a good way to think about this is fuels are now more continuous vertically, meaning they can move up trees on ladder fuels like small trees and become larger crown fires. And that the fuels are also more continuous horizontally. So vegetation like invasive annual grasses can contribute to spatially larger wildfires. Next slide, please. But as we move to the Northeast, and I'm going to hand it over to our next regional fire specialist, I want to end on a positive note. Our regional fire specialist, Micah from Northeast Oregon, is joining us by recording today because he's actually out on the Deschutes National Forest participating in a prescribed fire training that's happening there. And so that really testifies to the fact that as we tell these stories of how fire has changed over time, we also need to incorporate all the positive changes that are happening and the growing beneficial effects of prescribed fire out on landscapes in places like the Deschutes. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Micah Schmidt. I am the Regional Fire Specialist for Northeast Oregon. I'm based up here out of Union County, out of the town of LeGrand, which is approximately where the arrow is pointing, and I'll be talking to you about fire in Northeast Oregon. And before I jump into it, I just want to talk about something I find fascinating about the fire ecology of this area. So, I'm a forestry guy, so I often think about trees. And when I think about ponderosa pine, western larch, sometimes Douglas fir, I think of these trees that, face a lot of stressors, insects, disease, drought, high wind events, all these different things. And, often these things will live to be, hundreds of years old, sometimes, 1,000 years old. And they, survive fire after fire after fire. And we kind of see the legacy of this on the landscape with these cat-faced trees, which, you can see in the bottom of this ponderosa pine right here. This is a cat face formed by fire, and it probably holds a centuries-old record of frequent fire. So I just find that speaks to the resilience of the trees in this area and across other dry regions of Oregon. So I find that a really unique, fascinating thing about my region. So let's talk about the vegetation types that occur out here in Northeast Oregon. So this is Zumwalt Prairie. It's a great grassland prairie ecosystem, which is one of the primary vegetation types that would have covered a lot of this area in Northeast Oregon. Really encourage you to visit this preserve that is managed and owned by the Nature Conservancy. Really cool place. We've also got sagebrush steppe ecosystems, which are kind of a mix of different brushy species and various grasses. These often, interact with juniper systems. We've also got ponderosa pine forest out here. It's a really prevalent one. We got mixed conifer forests, which occur a lot in the Blue Mountains, and these can really vary, going up in elevation, and once you get into different, precipitation levels and different site moisture. We've also got alpine and subalpine ecosystems, which have whitebark pine, subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce, a lot of different species. And these can live in some pretty harsh environments. And just want to note that with all these vegetation types and the rest that occur out here, they really intermingle across the landscape. So we see a lot of, areas like this picture here where you got rangeland, forest land intermingling. You can step out of one vegetation type right into another. So it really, makes it really fun and interesting kind of land management dynamic, trying to figure out how to manage all this diverse landscape. So when we think of historical fire, we can think of fire as the primary disturbance process that shaped the forest, rangelands, riparian areas, pretty much every ecosystem and vegetation type throughout Northeast Oregon. So in our forest, which we know the most about, given that we can look at fire scars that are held in tree rings over time. We had low severity fire was a big part of these ecosystems. Would have helped to maintain these widely spaced ponderosa pine and other species forests that really fire kept all the competing vegetation down. It left a sparse number of trees out there, kind of scattered across the landscape, sometimes occurring in individuals, sometimes in clumps, and it really helped these trees grow nice and old. And I really like this Gary Larson comic for you, fans of Farsight out there. You see this ring right here, Jimmy. That's another time when the old fella miraculously survived some big forest fire. When you talk to loggers that were around during the days when they were logging a lot of our old growth, they saw fire scar after fire scar when they were cutting these trees down. So really interesting to look back at that history. And it's not just fire is not just useful in our forest ecosystems. We didn't have highways like this one pictured in the picture down there, but this is a prescribed fire that we were doing, and this is in a wetland kind of grass complex, and we were trying to promote tule, which is a really important plant for our indigenous friends. They'd use it for both fibers and for food and a variety of other uses. So fire had a lot of benefits. It wasn't just controlling vegetation, but it was also promoting some of the things to meet the management objectives of the people that were living on this landscape for so long. And when we think of current fire, we can think of one thing that has really changed our landscapes and how fire interacts, and that's fire suppression. So once we lost fire for the last 100 to 150 years, started putting out all the fires, we see this really dense, continuous buildup of trees that really continues across the landscape. Fire can move through them really quickly. And, this was kind of exemplified in the 2015 Canyon Creek complex, where fire burned over a really large area in the Malheur National Forest into the Strawberry Mountain Wilderness. Left lots of dead trees, really burned to high severity, really an unusual fire event, when you're looking at how fire historically moved through our area. These are some before and after photos, or not before and after, post fire and more post fire, this was about a year after fire right here. And you can see several years later, this is cheatgrass and other invasive annual grass have come in and taken over these severely burned areas, and they create, another fire management dilemma, because these are really hard to get rid of, and they're really flammable and can kind of continue to promote fire moving rapidly at high intensity across our landscapes. And it's not just in our forest landscapes. We have longer fire seasons, less snowpack, more drought, all these things that contribute to fire also burning pretty intensely through our agricultural and rangelands. This is from the 2018 substation fire in Sherman and Wasco County. Moved through a variety of vegetation types and showing it's not just our forests that burn, it's everything. So all these fires, We still get a lot of low intensity, what we call good fire, but we get a lot more of the quote unquote bad fire, the fire that burns at really high severity, leaves landscapes kind of denuded, and leaves them in an area where it's hard to restore, the functional characteristics of those ecosystems. So with that, I really hope that you learned a little bit about fire in Northeast Oregon up here. And I hope you'll want to dive in more. We got lots of resources to talk about fire. So thank you. I'm going to put the move for let the next regional fire specialist discuss their region. So thanks.
Yeah, well, with that, I think I'm the last region for today. So I'm Katie Wolstein. I'm the rangeland fire specialist in Southeastern Oregon. And so Southeastern Oregon rangelands are part of the Northern Great Basin, and this is a cool desert. And so these lands are characterized by really hot summers, really cool winters, and relatively little precipitation. So as an example, I live in Burns, and we get about 12 inches of precip a year. Just this morning it was snowing, so happy May to you all. And there's quite a lot of diversity in even Oregon's rangelands. This is largely related to that really limited precipitation, and then also the elevation. So there on the left is relatively low, Wyoming big sagebrush. The middle there with all the colorful forbs that are out this time of year is higher elevation rangelands where there's a little bit more precipitation. You might get some Wyoming big sagebrush mixed in with mountain sagebrush. And then there on the right is our higher elevation rangelands, where you have western juniper, mixed with sagebrush understory, and it's a lot rockier and drier. We also have several wildlife species that are unique to rangelands. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of greater sage grouse. They're the spiky looking bird on the top, pygmy rabbits. And then the primary land use activity out here is ranching. Go ahead, Carrie. And so in terms of how fire historically behaves in these places, so this is a beautiful sagebrush bunchgrass plant community. And as you can see where the arrow is there, perennial bunch grasses naturally create these bare inner spaces between the plants. It's because those large clumps of grasses accumulate all the nutrients in the soil. And so the effect of this when you have a fire is that there isn't this continuous fuel load to carry fire really rapidly across the landscape. And so these grasses, these are our fine fuels in this system, they might readily ignite. We get a lot of lightning ignitions between 2009 and 2018 in the Burns Bureau of Land Management District. 68% of starts were from lightning. And so that's naturally how fire has occurred. And so yes, these grasses may ignite and maybe they'll carry fire a little way, but it's hard to burn really large areas. The sagebrush, it's highly volatile. There's a lot of chemicals in the leaves. For those of you who've smelled it, that's what you're smelling. And so they do burn long and hot. And so that can result in increased burn severity around the immediate vicinity of those plants. But again, if there's relatively low fuel continuity, those perennial bunch grasses and bare interspaces, then that high burn severity is pretty much limited to the immediate vicinity of the sagebrush. Go ahead, Carrie. And so the result of this is, in general, historically with fire on rangelands, we had smaller interspersed burn patches. And so this resulted in a mix, a habitat mosaic, different species, different successional stages for different parts of their lives. And then also high bunchgrass recovery. We didn't see mass mortality from really hot burning fires. Their underground root structures, because it didn't burn very hot, are fairly safe, and those plants can resprout. Sage grouse in general might die from these events, but they grow from seed and can reestablish over 30 plus years. And so in general, these are our lower Wyoming big sagebrush sites. We saw the fire return interval about every 30 to 100 years. Next slide. And so in terms of change, we have some changed land use practices, climate change over the last 200 years. But if I had to pick one major driver in Southeastern Oregon rangelands that have altered fire regimes, it's the introduction of invasive annual grasses. And so for us, this is mostly cheatgrass, Medusa head, and ventonata. And how they work is they dry out early. They create a high fuel load, create fuel continuity where there were formerly those bare interspaces. And what this does, some scientific studies have found in annual grass dominated communities, this increases the likelihood that ignition will start and propagate fire. So we have increased probability of fire off the bat where we have a lot of invasive annual grasses. In this figure from a colleague here at the Eastern Oregon Agriculture Research Center, this just demonstrates those open circles up top are non-invaded perennial bunch grass plant communities out here. And you can see because that line is higher, the fuel moisture remains higher longer into the season than that lower line, those closed circles where there are cheatgrass dominated plant communities. Go ahead, Carrie. And so during fire, where we have these invasive annual grasses, they readily burn, they create this continuous fuel bed. And so we see increased rates of spread. This may lead to larger fires because it might be more difficult for fire responders to get around them and contain them. Go ahead, Carrie. And then lastly, here's the crux of it. Fires create a disturbance. A lot of times we get bare soil after fire, and annual grasses are super great at quickly monopolizing those freed up resources. Even the fall after a burn, they might establish more quickly than those native species, and this increases the probability of more fire. And so in this graph on the right, where you have higher medusa head density, so to the far right of that horizontal axis, you have lower diversity of the overall plant community. And so it's self-reinforcing and perpetuates the problem. Go ahead, Carrie. And so this creates what's called the invasive annual grass fire cycle, where plant communities may be invaded. This increases the likelihood of fire, and then these fires can spread rapidly and make those communities more susceptible to further invasion and further future fire. Go ahead, Carrie. And so fire today is not looking great, mostly due to the invasive annual grasses. So this is a figure showing the entire Great Basin in North America, and that green square there is Oregon. You can see Bend there in the very left of that. And so that first figure is mean fire probability for the last 20 years between 2000 and 2021. And so where it's dark red shows that fire probability has increased over time. That center figure shows that the trend in fire probability has changed over time. And then on the far right, the burn frequency has also increased. So those darker red or purple places are places that have burned again and again and again. And so if you were to overlay invasive annual grass extent on these maps, you would see that there's a direct relationship between those invasive species and the likelihood of fire. And this affects communities that are dependent on rangeland resources for their livelihoods and for kind of cultural persistence of their ways of life. And so thanks for your attention today, and looking forward to your questions later.
Great. So thank you to all of the regional fire specialists for taking us on that journey and providing a snapshot of fire in Oregon. We hope that this webinar has provided you an understanding that not all flame is the same, and that fire has had and still has a role in shaping Oregon's diverse ecosystems like our forests and rangelands. Each specialist has illustrated for us how fire in each place has changed over time due to fire suppression, changes in climate, forest management, land use changes, and more, which has made the solutions to our current fire situation look different in different places. And as EJ mentioned earlier, how we experience and live with fire, therefore, is going to look different on the coast, in the gorge, or in the sage steppe. So the important question to ask ourselves then is, given that we know fire is a natural and necessary part of our landscapes, is how can we, and this includes you all out there, how can we live better with fire? Well, I'd say by showing up today with curiosity about not all flame is the same, you are already starting to live better with fire. You can use this place-based knowledge of fire to help prepare yourself for the upcoming wildfire season. And given that May is National Wildfire Awareness Month, our agency partners have a lot of activities planned and resources to share to help you prepare this season. For example, Keep Oregon Green, the Oregon State Fire Marshal, the Oregon Department of Forestry, the Oregon Department of Emergency Management, and the Oregon Department of Transportation will each be posting to various social media platforms to share information on things like defensible space, fire-resistant plants, debris burning, campfires, evacuation, and vehicle fires. There are also webinars happening throughout the month, fire-free days in Central Oregon, citywide cleanup days in Jacksonville, and more. The Oregon State Fire Marshal has a calendar of events posted on their website where you can get connected with all your local opportunities. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can put that in the chat, that link. And there you go. That's to the Oregon State Fire Marshal's calendar. Let's check the time. We're at almost 5 minutes till noon. So at this point, I want to open it up to questions. We might have only time for 1 or 2 questions specific to your local ecology. So let me just go ahead and check the chat. Let's see. Katie, would you mind answering, sagebrush can reproduce from seed after fire for 30 years? I don't understand how. Would you mind answering that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So it takes 30 years for sagebrush to reproduce from seed to reach maturity, so that that plant community looks like it may have prior to the burn. And so, you know, just really slow growing. In contrast, we also have rabbit brush is kind of our shrub species out here, and that doesn't necessarily need to reproduce from seed after disturbance. Rabbit brush can resprout if there's some growth structures left after disturbance, whereas sagebrush starts from ground zero, and it can be really hard to get to germinate. That's one difficulty we have with restoration in this area.
Great, thank you for that, Katie. Maybe one more quick question. I'm sorry that there's not a lot of time for questions, but our specialists have been typing answers to your questions in the Q&A. So be sure to check back with that if you've asked a question. One has come in, what are the biggest knowledge gaps in our understanding of fire? What research is needed to be able to make better decisions about how we live in Oregon with fire? I expect it to be different answer for each ecosystem, says this person. So I invite anybody on the team to, you know, come on camera and go ahead and answer that question.
I can speak to that yet again, but looking forward to hearing from my colleagues. Really appreciate this question. From my perspective, we have the science. One of the biggest limitations, at least in my world, I think, is implementing that. And so rearranging our institutions so they can adapt to real-time information. We have a lot of environmental variability out here, and so nimbly deploy management treatments in response to emergent needs is a big need I see. Those treatments are supported by science, and so it's kind of the logistical and institutional barriers that, at least in my world, really need to be addressed.
Great, thank you for that, Katie. Chris, I see you on camera. Did you want to also
No,
chime in?
Katie's response is great. We need science to tell us how we can use science to make decisions. No, it's true. We have a lot of information, but we also have to deal with a lot of changes. Climate change is changing a lot of things. In Southwest Oregon, many trees are dying from drought. We have millions of dead Douglas firs, and we don't know how all of these emerging changes on the landscape will affect fire behavior. We have to prioritize because we can't be everywhere all the time. There are many parts of the ecosystem, species, things that we need to weigh, and it's really complex. And that's, I hope, one thing that you took away from this is that the more you dig into this issue, the more the answer is, it depends. How do we do this in this place? How do we do this in this other place? It's not the same. We have to learn about the local ecosystem. We have to work with a lot of different people with a lot of different interests. So we could always use some more science on a lot of topics.
Well, so unfortunately, we're really close to time, so I'm just gonna thank you for all those great questions. Again, our specialists have been working hard in the background to answer the questions that have popped up. And now we have some questions for you. The work we do in Extension Fire Program would benefit from hearing from you. You can provide us with answers to these questions by taking a very short survey. This survey will help us improve the quality of engagements we offer and provide us with insight into topics you'd like to learn more about. So let me go ahead and put that survey link in the chat. And it's a really short survey. It should just take 1 minute or less to complete. And so I will send a follow-up email with the webinar recording and links to various resources, including the survey link I just put in the chat. And I just want to say on behalf of the entire OSU Extension Fire team, folks, why don't you come online again, show your faces. We'd like to thank you for your time and interest today in Not All Flame is the Same. Thank you so much.